Archangel Michael says your name is being called in a room that feels like thunder hiding inside silence. He says the air feels heavy because a decision is pressing on your chest like a stone on still water. He says you will feel a pull tonight and you must not turn away from it. He says a door has been opening and closing in your life without a handle and you wondered why you kept hearing echoes. He says the echoes were reminders that the path chosen long ago still waits for your footsteps. He says the hour has come to step and not hesitate. He says you stood at a crossroads lit by a pale gold light and you pretended it was only the sun playing tricks. He says there was a pattern written across those stones and it spelled the outline of your next chapter. He says your heart recognized it even when your mind tried to forget. He says the warning is not punishment and not fear and not panic. He says the warning is a lantern lifted high so you can see the nails that would tear your sandals. He says the warning is mercy speaking in a language older than regret. He says a shadow has been standing 2 steps behind you in certain rooms. He says it uses kindness as a costume and stories as a net. He says you already felt it each time your gut twisted then smoothed itself because you convinced it to be quiet. He says there is a message sealed with blue fire that keeps returning to your doorstep. He says you brushed it away like dust because dust is easier to ignore than letters with your true name. He says the letter will glow again tonight and you will finally understand its edges. He says someone once told you that your dreams were too loud for this world. He says the ones who said that were afraid of hearing their own hearts beating awake. He says your dreams grew quiet out of politeness and now they are done being polite. He says time has been moving like a river that pretends to be a mirror. He says you looked into it and saw familiar faces even while the current pulled new ones into place. He says the mirror is cracking so you can see the river underneath. He says there is an arrangement of events about to lean into each other like dominoes tipped by invisible breath. He says the first tile is a conversation that arrives in ordinary clothes. He says the last tile is a gate that opens without a sound. He says you know the person who acts warm by morning and cold by night. He says they carry a silver tongue that shapes promises like coins you can never spend. He says they learned your rhythms so they can knock at your spirit when you feel weakest. He says do not let borrowed voices rewrite your pages. He says do not let fear hire itself as your advisor. He says do not let false urgency drag you into a contract with regret. He says the real urgency is the sound of your calling drawing nearer. He says the real urgency is the harvest ready before its stalks fall to the ground. He says the real urgency is your name being spoken with authority that heals old fractures. He says your room will feel different tonight and you will not imagine it. He says the temperature will shift as if a window opened where there is no window. He says the change will mark the hour your timeline begins to braid itself into strength. He says he cried because you keep carrying loads that never belonged to you. He says the tears fell like small storms that wash streets clean. He says he cried because he knows where those loads came from and he knows how far you have dragged them. He says someone traced your doubt like chalk lines around a treasure. He says they thought if you questioned yourself long enough the treasure would bury itself again. He says the chalk is dissolving in his rain and the treasure is rising. He says your hands remember skills you have not used for years. He says your tongue remembers a speech you have not given yet. He says your eyes remember the path even in darkness because truth leaves luminous dust. He says a message traveled across 7 thresholds to find you. He says each threshold tested whether you were ready to hear it. He says you are ready now because your pain has turned into listening. He says the danger is subtle and wrapped in convenience. He says it will look like the easy way home and feel like a shortcut through tall grass. He says the grass hides holes dug by those who smile without warmth. He says the opportunity is hidden inside a difficult kindness. He says it asks you to be brave without spectacle. He says it asks you to choose alignment over applause. He says there is a city you will touch with your feet even if you never leave your town. He says the city is made of choices and every street has a name you already know. He says walk the street called integrity and you will arrive at the square called peace. He says your future has a heartbeat you can hear when you place your palm over your chest before sleep. He says the rhythm is steady and insistent and full of soft thunder. He says the heartbeat keeps time with your courage, so keep your courage awake. He says your name has been mispronounced by those who benefit from your smallness. He says he is teaching the world to say it with the right weight. He says when your name is said right your shoulders rise like gates. He says there is a key woven into your daily rituals. He says it turns when you choose presence over autopilot. He says it unlocks a door labeled capacity and the handle is warm. He says you will notice red flags lined up like prayer beads on a string. He says do not cut the string and scatter them into excuses. He says count them and understand the pattern and step aside before they tangle your feet. He says you feared being alone with your own voice. He says you feared it because it told the truth without bargaining. He says tonight your voice will be a friend that stands beside you like a tree. He says a promise is coming to you wearing working clothes. He says it will not arrive with fireworks and noise. He says it will arrive with steady light that does not flicker in wind. He says you will remember a time you said yes when you meant no. He says you will forgive yourself so the lesson can breathe. He says you will carry that forgiveness like a passport across new borders. He says prepare a corner of your space for clarity. He says clarity likes order in small places so it can expand into large places. He says a tidy desk becomes a clear horizon. He says you hold a map that looks blank until you tilt it. He says when you tilt it the ink glows and routes appear. He says the map agrees with those who act. He says the warning includes a name you will not speak aloud. He says you will write it privately and feel the weight lift. He says the act of naming breaks the enchantment that fed on silence. He says the path forward is not crowded. He says crowds gather at the entrances and leave the inner rooms empty. He says you belong in the inner room where decisions become outcomes. He says your ancestors stand behind you like a quiet choir. He says they do not shout and they do not push. He says they hum a note that steadies your breathing. He says the past will knock in the form of an old habit. He says you will open the door only to close it gently. He says the habit will walk away because it no longer finds shelter in you. He says your generosity has been borrowed without permission. He says from now on it will be invested with intelligence. He says generosity plus wisdom builds foundations that hold in storms. He says you are not late for your own life. He says the clock you feared is a rumor made of comparison. He says your hour is not on their schedule because your assignment is not their work. He says someone will try to confuse you with urgency that benefits them. He says breathe and let their emergency return to its owner. He says your peace will not be rented out anymore. He says the dream that felt impossible wanted you to grow into it slowly. He says it dressed in daily practice so you would not be intimidated. He says it is ready to wear its full size now. He says the next chapter opens when you stop apologizing for being exact. He says exactness is love for truth and care for outcomes. He says your precision will be a lantern that others follow. He says there is a number that keeps repeating near you. He says it marks alignment and points to a window of momentum. He says pay attention to the moments it appears and move with the current. He says an offer will be made that looks golden from far away. He says up close you will see the paint and the cracks. He says choose the honest wood and build your own table. He says you once pledged loyalty to a version of yourself that was only a shelter. He says that version protected you when the weather was cruel. He says the weather has changed and the shelter can become a doorway. He says your body knows when your spirit is being drained. He says the heaviness around your shoulders is not mystery. He says it is the invoice of boundaries left unpaid and today the debt is cancelled. He says the next 24 hours are a bridge made of attention. He says step on it deliberately and look at the planks beneath your feet. He says each plank is a choice and each choice has a sound like a chord. He says you will receive a message that arrives at an odd time. He says the time is a clue that it is not ordinary. He says answer it with calm and keep your center. He says someone will remember what you did for them years ago. He says they will return with a door you did not expect. He says you will walk through it because you deserve corridors that lead somewhere. He says you are about to outgrow secrecy that was never yours. He says transparency will feel like a clean river. He says those who cannot swim in clarity will drift away and it will be right. He says the warning carries tenderness because tenderness guards you better than fear. He says tenderness lets you hear what harshness drowns. He says tenderness keeps you awake to subtle miracles. He says the ground beneath you is stable. He says the shaking you feel is not collapse but rearrangement. He says the new order will make sense when the dust settles. He says the person with bright words and dim actions has revealed themselves enough. He says you will not paint them brighter again. He says you will let their true wattage stand and plan accordingly. He says honor the pace that keeps respect for your nervous system. He says speed without respect is a thief. He says urgency with wisdom is a guide. He says your creativity is not a hobby pretending to be small. He says it is a river that irrigates fields you have not even planted. He says the river is rising and it is a blessing. He says your memory will retrieve a detail that unlocks a sequence. He says that detail is the little hinge on a great door. He says the door swings and the room lights up. He says your future partners will know you by your steadiness. He says they will feel safe in your presence because you are aligned. He says alignment is a fragrance that fills whole houses. He says you will feel a single clear sentence land inside your chest. He says that sentence will be your compass line for this season. He says write it and keep it where your eyes can rest on it. He says gratitude will be your power plant. He says it will not be noisy and it will not brag. He says the light it produces will make every next step visible. He says you are protected even when you are tired. He says tiredness will not become your identity. He says rest is not weakness and rest is not retreat. He says beware of flattery that tastes like sugar and later burns the tongue. He says choose feedback that is firm and loving. He says it will build you instead of inflate you. He says the future calls you by the name of builder. He says you will design mornings that fit your spirit. He says you will stack habits like bricks and raise a home for consistency. He says the old narrative told you that suffering was the only proof of growth. He says the new narrative tells you that wisdom is the proof. He says peace becomes the signature. He says your circle will narrow and your impact will widen. He says that is the geometry of purpose. He says accuracy beats popularity every time. He says your hands will hold paperwork that once scared you. He says the words will make sense like constellations on a clear night. He says you will sign with confidence and step forward. He says the companion you deserve understands silence. He says they do not fear your depths. He says your hearts will face the same horizon and that is enough. He says the city of your future has open windows. He says the wind there is gentle and honest. He says you have already packed what you need to move in. He says you will receive confirmation through a simple sign placed in your path. He says you will know it because peace will land on your shoulders like a shawl. He says you will smile without thinking and that will be your yes. He says do not bargain with clarity. He says do not delay the kindness you owe yourself. He says do not apologize for doing what your soul recognizes as healthy. He says your gifts are not waiting for permission. He says they are waiting for your scheduling. He says put them on the calendar like non-negotiable sunlight. He says the past will try one last time to dress in the future's colors. He says your discernment will strip the costume off with a glance. He says you will walk on. He says the message is not meant to frighten you into smallness. He says it is meant to lift your chin and straighten your spine. He says it is meant to set your steps in rhythm with courage. He says a letter is already writing itself from your tomorrow to your today. He says it tells you that your steady choices were seeds that became shelter. He says it thanks you for tending the garden even on days of little rain. He says your eyes will clear like windows washed after a long season. He says you will see clean lines where there used to be fog. He says decisions will feel like well-fitted shoes. He says there is a melody written into the bones of your house. He says when you move with integrity the walls hum softly. He says harmony returns when the occupants are honest. He says the tools you need are simple and strong. He says attention is a tool and boundaries are a tool and rest is a tool. He says with these you can build anything worth keeping. He says the person who spoke against you will learn silence. He says that silence will not be your responsibility. He says your only job is to continue your assignment with dignity. He says beauty will find you in the small hours. He says it will arrive as a sentence, a color, a scent that lifts memory. He says this is how the soul says thank you. He says your path will be marked by ease that comes from alignment not avoidance. He says you will recognize this ease because it makes you brave not lazy. He says it makes you generous not reckless. He says your future home has a table where your name is carved. He says the carving was done by time and truth. He says you will sit there and feel entirely yourself. He says the warning has done its work in you. He says you have heard and you have understood. He says you will act with quiet certainty that needs no permission slip. He says the sky will not break when you say no to what harms you. He says the ground will not swallow you when you say yes to what heals you. He says the universe will rearrange to respect your clarity. He says your light is not a performance. He says your light is a byproduct of integrity. He says integrity does not shout and does not bargain and does not shake. He says your breath carries authority when you speak truth. He says your steps carry authority when you choose consistency. He says your presence carries authority when you honor your boundaries. He says the road that kept turning into detours has reached the main lane. He says the signs ahead are legible and kind. He says the journey continues with better company and better weather. He says there will be a day soon that feels like the first morning after a long storm. He says the sunlight will be gentle on your skin. He says you will realize the storm was already losing power the moment you listened. He says your listening has saved you from paths that ended in sorrow. He says your listening has guided you to rooms with open windows. He says your listening is now strong enough to carry others without losing yourself. He says rest now in the knowledge that you are guided. He says move now in the strength that you are equipped. He says speak now in the confidence that you are cleared to proceed. He says this chapter ends with dignity and begins with joy. He says the bridge holds because you are walking it awake. He says all is aligned for your next faithful step. He says the tears he shed were not despair. He says the tears were an anointing poured over your choices. He says the glow you feel in your chest is the oil of clarity settling into your bones. He says breathe and step and do the next right thing in front of you. He says the warning has become wisdom and the wisdom has become peace. He says your life turns like a page and the fresh paragraph has begun. He says the message is complete and the hour is kind. He says look at your hands and see capability where you once saw worry. He says you are ready and the path agrees. He says go forward with a steady heart. He says keep your eyes bright and your shoulders unburdened. He says the guardians of your purpose stand watch as you move. He says here is the seal on this letter. He says it is a seal made of courage pressed into wax made of truth. He says no counterfeit hand can break it. He says remember who you are when noise tries to blur your edges. He says remember what you carry when scarcity tries to cloud your sight. He says remember where you are going when detours try to look like destiny. He says the night will pass and your morning will be clean. He says your house will hold a calmer air. He says the path beyond your door will meet your feet like an old friend. He says this is the moment you become fully yourself. He says this is the moment your steps sound like certainty on stone. He says this is the moment the warning transforms into a banner of peace. He says stand tall now and feel the alignment settle. He says the storm behind you bows its head. He says the horizon ahead opens its arms. He says you have everything you need to complete the work of this season. He says your yes is strong and your no is clean. He says your spirit is bright and your way is clear. He says he will walk with you as you choose your steps. He says he will guard your edges as you take brave action. He says he will keep your name in rooms where favor gathers. He says the message ends but the guidance remains. He says the page closes but the story continues with light. He says you may rest now in trust and rise now in purpose. He says this is the promise you carry like a soft bell in your ribs. He says when you move you will hear it and remember. He says you are seen and kept and ready. If you wish to express your support further, you have the option to give super thanks, with contributions of up to $20. Archangel Michael says the next layer opens when you honor your first instinct. He says your first instinct is the sound of truth standing at attention. He says you will feel it like a steady drum beneath the noise. He says gather your energy back from rooms that do not respect it. He says call your focus home like a lantern returning to the porch at dusk. He says presence is wealth and you are now wealthy in attention. He says prepare a list of 3 clean priorities for this week. He says let those priorities decide your schedule the way a compass decides footsteps. He says the calendar becomes a shield when it is aligned with your purpose. He says there is a phone call you do not need to answer. He says silence can be an answer that protects your peace. He says your yes will grow stronger because your no is finally honest. He says the person who keeps moving the goalposts has shown their pattern. He says stop playing on a field where the rules change to keep you losing. He says choose a field where the boundaries are clear and the score means growth. He says your home wants to breathe. He says remove 3 objects that carry stale stories. He says open a window in your spirit and let the air refresh your thoughts. He says your work will bear fruit when you stop explaining your roots to those who do not value trees. He says quiet momentum beats loud promises. He says the harvest respects consistent hands. He says the next door appears when you keep your word to yourself. He says integrity is the password that unlocks upgrades. He says your courage will be recognized without you announcing it. He says your sleep will become deeper once you release borrowed worry. He says worry that is not yours rusts the gears of your clarity. He says put it down and feel your mind hum like a tuned instrument. He says a message in plain clothes will arrive by morning. He says it will look simple and carry profound direction. He says respond with gratitude and move your feet. He says step out of triangles where you are asked to rescue what refuses responsibility. He says you are not a fire extinguisher for other people's unlit matches. He says choose mutuality over martyrdom. He says your finances desire respect and a plan. He says assign every coin a job so none of them run away. He says order invites increase the way clean soil invites rain. He says the shadow that trailed you fed on your attention. He says attention is food and you can choose the guest list. He says starve what drains you and feed what builds you. He says practice 5 minutes of deliberate stillness each day. He says stillness is not laziness, stillness is calibration. He says a calibrated heart chooses wisely on the first try. He says someone will praise you in public and dismiss you in private. He says collect actions, not adjectives. He says align with the ones who treat you with the same respect when no one is watching. He says your name is written on a door that requires preparation. He says prepare without spectacle. He says the ready are found by opportunity like a lighthouse finds ships. He says stop apologizing for outgrowing the room that once fit. He says growth is a relocation of truth. He says the new room has higher windows and better air. He says your timeline will compress when you remove distractions dressed as entertainment. He says joy is not the same as numbing. He says choose joy that leaves you stronger than it found you. He says write the sentence that governs this season. He says let every decision bow to that sentence. He says your days will align like notes in a chord. He says your body carries messages from your spirit. He says notice where tension gathers and ask it for the boundary it requests. He says meeting that request will restore your focus. He says the door marked collaboration will open after you honor the door marked solitude. He says solitude refines the signal so collaboration amplifies music instead of noise. He says the right partners hear the refined signal and respond in kind. He says an old fear will knock gently this week. He says greet it like an acquaintance who no longer intimidates you. He says thank it for trying to protect you and ask it to step aside. He says the paperwork on your desk becomes lighter when you approach it with clarity rather than dread. He says dread multiplies tasks and clarity simplifies them. He says begin with one page and momentum will carry the rest. He says your voice is needed in a room where silence enabled confusion. He says speak with clean words and steady posture. He says your honesty will rearrange the furniture of the conversation. He says protect the morning like a sacred gate. He says the first hour trains the entire day. He says put your priorities at the gate so your day salutes them. He says your digital world needs the same boundaries as your physical world. He says curate your inputs like ingredients for a healthy mind. He says a clean feed becomes a clean field. He says the next contact will arrive through someone you helped without expecting return. He says reciprocity travels slowly but arrives with gifts. He says open the door and receive without guilt. He says you will recognize a counterfeit offer because it cannot survive detailed questions in your own mind. He says the true offer grows clearer with scrutiny. He says test everything by alignment and longevity. He says your confidence becomes quiet as it matures. He says quiet confidence builds strong rooms. He says those rooms hold peace during weather. He says grief you postponed will ask for a chair at your table. He says give it a seat and a time limit. He says when it feels seen, it leaves in dignity and you remain lighter. He says celebration is not a luxury, celebration is maintenance. He says honor small victories so big victories have a path to land. He says the heart runs farther when it is thanked. He says stop renting your imagination to other people's doubts. He says reclaim your inner stage and cast courage as the lead. He says the show becomes your true story. He says your path includes helping others without losing yourself. He says share tools, not your backbone. He says teach them to stand, do not lend them your spine. He says your next learning will move from information to embodiment. He says knowing becomes doing when you schedule it. He says the gap closes when the calendar agrees. He says the person you once envied now becomes a mirror for your own potential. He says turn envy into study and study into practice. He says practice becomes mastery before applause arrives. He says the old agreement with scarcity is expiring. He says abundance is not noise, abundance is order multiplied. He says order your space, order your time, and watch resources cooperate. He says forgiveness does not erase accountability. He says forgiveness releases you from carrying their weight. He says accountability returns them to their own lessons. He says a trip may be offered, near or far. He says go if it serves growth and honors your priorities. He says decline if it flatters ego and taxes peace. He says your creativity has a practical assignment. He says build the thing that solves a real problem for real people. He says usefulness will open doors that vanity cannot knock upon. He says your reputation will stabilize when your values remain predictable. He says predictability in values is not dull, it is trustworthy. He says trust is the currency of long roads. He says your reflection will feel kinder when your habits match your hopes. He says choose one habit today that your future thanks. He says stack it tomorrow and the day after until it becomes your normal. He says the person who gossips to you will gossip about you. He says treat that knowledge as a map of where not to invest. He says loyalty prefers quiet truth over noisy flattery. He says the next season requires fewer keys and more doors that recognize your fingerprint. He says your fingerprint is integrity pressed into time. He says doors open when integrity arrives. He says anchors are good until they become cages. He says examine every anchor and keep only the ones that secure, not the ones that trap. He says travel light enough to move when favor shifts. He says your gratitude journal is a ledger of strength. He says write what stood strong today. He says strength multiplies when it is noticed. He says this warning has evolved into a path of instruction. He says instruction becomes protection when practiced. He says protection becomes peace when sustained. He says now breathe and feel the ground agree with your feet. He says raise your eyes and watch the horizon brighten. He says step forward and let your life confirm what you have chosen. Archangel Michael says the next decision will arrive quietly like a letter slid under your door. He says you will recognize it by the peace that follows, not by the noise that precedes. He says choose what leaves your spirit steady. He says the room you are building inside yourself needs light and air. He says open the shutters by telling the truth in small, practical sentences. He says honesty is ventilation for the soul. He says stand where your values cannot be negotiated. He says when the wind rises, anchors matter more than sails. He says your anchor is the promise you made to yourself. He says an agreement made in haste needs revision. He says rewrite it so your boundaries are included this time. He says your signature means something now. He says the path of least resistance often leads to a shallow pool. He says the path of aligned resistance leads to deep water that strengthens you. He says swim where you grow. He says your discernment is sharpening like a well-kept blade. He says a sharp edge cuts cleanly through confusion. He says wield it without apology and without cruelty. He says the season ahead wants your full attention. He says attention is the rare currency that buys transformation. He says invest it where returns are real. He says practice leaving rooms that dim your clarity. He says you do not need permission to carry your light elsewhere. He says dignity travels well. He says someone close to you loves what you can do for them but neglects who you are. He says that imbalance has reached its limit. He says choose reciprocity without drama. He says your daily rhythm will decide your next victories. He says begin mornings with intent and end nights with review. He says small hinges swing big doors. He says you will be asked to carry a story that is not yours. He says decline and watch your shoulders rise. He says relief is proof of the right choice. He says the friendship that went cloudy will either clear or close. He says let actions forecast the weather, not words. He says accept the climate and dress your heart accordingly. He says your name will appear in a space you once thought was locked to you. He says walk in with respect and readiness. He says opportunity favors those who rehearsed in private. He says a pattern of near wins is ending. He says the finish line will meet your feet because your focus no longer wanders. He says follow through is your new accent. He says late night scrolling steals tomorrow's strength. He says guard sleep like it guards you. He says rested minds make sturdy decisions. He says express what you expect and then expect what you expressed. He says clarity upstream prevents conflict downstream. He says put it in writing where needed. He says organize your resources with gratitude and strategy. He says a labeled shelf is a labeled future. He says order makes room for increase. He says kindness does not require access. He says set distances that protect your progress. He says love can be warm and far at the same time. He says prepare a page titled Non-Negotiables. He says list what keeps you healthy in body, mind, and work. He says defend that list without a speech. He says your courage will arrive in useful sizes. He says today it is 5 minutes of action, tomorrow it is a decisive hour. He says momentum multiplies when honored. He says the opportunity that suits you will not demand you shrink. He says it will ask for your best, not your silence. He says choose rooms that welcome your full height. He says release the habit of forecasting failure. He says forecast practice, patience, and progress. He says your forecast becomes your weather. He says your intuition already sent 3 messages. He says you heard them all, now act on one. He says action is the reply intuition deserves. He says the gift you carry solves a real problem. He says describe that problem clearly and offer the solution simply. He says people find what they can understand. He says gratitude is better measured in attention than adjectives. He says let your care show up as consistency. He says consistency is love with a schedule. He says your circle will tighten so your aim can sharpen. He says fewer voices, better signal. He says better signal, cleaner steps. He says a door you once knocked on will knock on you. He says answer with preparedness, not surprise. He says prepared hearts hear opportunity's language. He says do not over-explain a boundary. He says say it once, say it clean, and hold it. He says repetition trains only those who refuse respect. He says your craft wants a higher standard. He says turn up the quality knob by 10% this week. He says excellence is a habit that compounds. He says the pace of others is not your metronome. He says your tempo is tuned to your task. He says run your lap with your breath. He says a simple system will do more than a complicated wish. He says build the checklist, then follow it. He says completion is confidence you can reuse. He says you will be tempted to fix what keeps breaking you. He says repair yourself, not the pattern that hurts you. He says leave the cycle to those who choose it. He says invest in tools that save time and protect energy. He says every minute reclaimed is a seed. He says plant reclaimed minutes in your purpose. He says your words should fit your actions like a glove. He says alignment makes your presence trustworthy. He says trust opens doors that talent alone cannot. He says celebrate private wins without waiting for applause. He says your spirit knows when to cheer. He says acknowledgement is fuel for the long road. He says your anger wants direction, not denial. He says direct it into discipline. He says disciplined energy builds, undirected energy burns. He says the invitation that requires you to forget yourself is not your invitation. He says accept only where you remain whole. He says wholeness is the fee you never waive. He says compare less and calibrate more. He says measurement against your own progress is honest. He says honesty keeps the path humane. He says the habit you add today replaces 3 you no longer need. He says upgrade by addition and release by choice. He says edits make masterpieces. He says your next mentor may be a book, a process, or a pattern. He says listen in every format. He says wisdom arrives through many doors. He says you will outgrow the fear of being seen. He says visibility is simply light meeting truth. He says step into it with clean motives. He says your creative river needs banks. He says boundaries shape flow into usefulness. He says usefulness attracts support. He says patience is not pause, patience is paced movement. He says move at the speed of comprehension, not distraction. He says comprehension seals the lesson. He says an old nickname no longer fits your strength. He says retire it quietly. He says your new name is responsibility with joy. He says assign every plan a review date. He says revision is care, not criticism. He says cared for plans survive weather. He says you will memorize the sound of your own yes. He says it is the tone of alignment. He says it hums in your bones when you speak it. He says an ending will be kind if you allow it to be honest. He says gratitude closes chapters without smoke. He says you may leave and bless simultaneously. He says harvest what you learned before you leave a field. He says reflection is the final tool of any season. He says tools stored clean are ready sooner. He says your discipline will free your future to be generous. He says structure today becomes gift tomorrow. He says generosity with backbone lasts. He says your calendar reveals your creed. He says write your priorities in time, not just in hope. He says time tells the truth. He says the door you feared is just a doorway with a story. He says walk through it and rewrite the ending. He says endings are beginnings with better information. He says your patience with yourself should match your patience with those you love. He says offer the same mercy inward. He says mercy grows results. He says the quiet choice you make now will echo for years. He says choose clean and let the echo be proud of you. He says echoes become legacy. He says file away the apology you keep drafting for being yourself. He says your existence is not an inconvenience. He says stand at full height and continue. He says your map has a mark labeled, today's courage. He says touch that mark with action before the day ends. He says tomorrow respects those who honored today. He says the warning that began this message has turned into wisdom you can use. He says wisdom carried is protection walking. He says keep walking, the way is clear and you are ready. Archangel Michael says choose the conversation that leaves you lighter. He says words can be shelter or storm, and you are allowed to walk into shelter. He says your peace is the proof you chose well. He says your schedule is a garden and every meeting is a seed. He says plant fewer, better seeds and watch the harvest improve. He says crowding suffocates growth, clarity lets roots breathe. He says there is bravery in closing tabs your heart never opened. He says attention returns like a flock when called with intention. He says call it back and let it land. He says the person who doubts you will borrow your certainty if you offer it freely. He says give them kindness but keep your compass. He says guidance without grounding drains both. He says your path is not a performance, it is a practice. He says practice becomes presence when repeated with care. He says presence attracts what performance pretends to have. He says your home wants a corner that belongs to creativity. He says make it simple, clean, and ready. He says readiness is an invitation to inspiration. He says the long detour taught you shortcuts that respect the soul. He says now you walk straighter because you know why curves exist. He says wisdom is a map with fewer legends and clearer roads. He says stop renting space in your mind to critics who never build. He says builders speak differently because responsibility shapes their tongue. He says listen for the sound of responsibility and align there. He says the next promise you make to yourself must be small enough to keep. He says kept promises form bridges. He says bridges carry momentum across doubt. He says your morning light is a teacher. He says let it remind you that beginnings do not need permission. He says open the curtains and agree with the day. He says an apology may be needed where silence lingered too long. He says offer it cleanly, without a story that protects pride. He says humility shortens distances. He says there is a room you will enter where your presence resets the tone. He says do not shrink to match old noise. He says let steadiness be the loudest thing about you. He says prepare a simple plan for your resources. He says earn, keep, grow, give, write the percentages and honor them. He says order invites opportunity. He says your body is honest even when your mind negotiates. He says notice the breath that shortens and the shoulders that rise. He says adjust the room or adjust the boundary. He says the offer that respects your time is the offer you can trust. He says people who honor time honor outcomes. He says choose outcomes over optics. He says a door will appear in the middle of your routine. He says it looks like a new question asked at the right moment. He says answer with the truth you practiced. He says your talent has been whispering for a higher standard. He says raise it by 10% and watch your future take notice. He says excellence introduces you before you speak. He says beware of urgency that arrives with flattery. He says real opportunity arrives with clarity and room to breathe. He says you cannot hear calling through a crowd of compliments. He says kindness is not consent to chaos. He says your boundaries make your kindness sustainable. He says sustainability is love's best friend. He says your story is entering a chapter where silence carries messages. He says rest between sentences and let meaning arrive. He says punctuation is wisdom. He says the habit you are building will rescue you on a storm day. He says build it now while the weather is kind. He says practice is the lifeboat you assemble in sunlight. He says you will be tempted to answer every knock. He says discern the door before the handle turns. He says not every knock is for you. He says gratitude recalibrates ambition. He says grateful ambition builds rather than consumes. He says build what serves and sleep well. He says an old label is slipping from your shoulders. He says do not tape it back on to make others comfortable. He says growth changes names. He says collaboration will find you when your contribution is clear. He says clarity is a beacon that saves everyone time. He says shine it without apology. He says your calendar should show your care. He says self-respect needs a time slot. He says write it like you would write a promise to a friend. He says an ending will be softer than you feared. He says honesty is the cushion. He says breathe, bless, and step through. He says your confidence is not volume, it is alignment. He says aligned choices feel quiet and immovable. He says that quiet is your anchor. He says the next learning arrives through repetition, not revelation. He says repeat the small right thing until it becomes your reflex. He says reflex is destiny in motion. He says hunger for applause will dilute your work. He says hunger for accuracy will refine it. He says refined work earns respect that lasts. He says you can forgive without format. He says let your release be practical, fewer calls, clear boundaries, simpler yes. He says practical peace is durable. He says the people who love you will notice the lift in your voice. He says lightness is evidence of alignment. He says alignment is the signature of truth. He says you will receive a message that feels like a key. He says try it on the door of reluctance. He says watch the hinges surrender. He says study what works and retire what only looks like it works. He says aesthetics without outcomes is costume. He says dress your days in function that still feels like you. He says choose the next right task and complete it fully. He says completion is a vote for the future you are building. He says keep voting. He says stop arguing with results. He says results are teachers that grade fairly. He says adjust, don't dramatize. He says kindness to yourself increases your capacity for others. He says capacity is the quiet expansion of a well-tended soul. He says expand gently. He says a friend may bring an opportunity wrapped as a favor. He says be generous, but check alignment. He says generosity should not hire resentment. He says your vision needs a simple sentence and a steady schedule. He says set the sentence at the top of the week. He says let the schedule protect it like a bodyguard. He says your next room is unlocked by reliability. He says be where you said, prepared as promised. He says reliability is rare, become rare. He says release cleverness that overcomplicates simple good work. He says simple and true travels farther than ornate and empty. He says pick true. He says protect your evenings like a garden recovering from the sun. He says quiet replenishes roots. He says roots feed tomorrow's branches. He says the inner critic loses power when measured. He says write its claims and test them against facts. He says truth trims noise. He says you will hear your future call your name in an ordinary moment. He says answer calmly and move one step. He says steps become stories. He says you are allowed to be proud of how far you walked. He says pride rooted in gratitude is stable. He says stand on that ground. He says make room for joy that does not ask permission. He says let it enter through small doors, tea, light, laughter. He says small doors lead to large rooms. He says an invitation will arrive that expects your invisibility. He says decline with grace and keep your light visible. He says visibility with integrity blesses the room. He says your desk is a negotiation table between you and your future. He says come to it on time with clear terms. He says your future will sign. He says your patience with process will become your advantage. He says most abandon at the quiet middle. He says you will stay until the work flowers. He says the weather of your mind clears when you finish one thing. He says completion is sunshine. He says bask and then begin again. He says the people meant for your next lane recognize consistency. He says they listen for it, not just look. He says let your rhythm speak. He says your attention is too precious to waste on rehearsing imaginary failures. He says rehearse truth, practice courage, stage follow-through. He says the show becomes real life. He says your standards are allowed to climb. He says climbing standards lift outcomes without loudness. He says rise quietly and let results introduce you. He says when fear arrives dressed as caution, ask it for data. He says data will show the difference between wisdom and stall. He says move with wisdom. He says your legacy is the echo of your daily choices. He says make choices that you would want to hear in a quiet room. He says echoes become inheritance. He says you have permission to rebuild without bitterness. He says clean building is faster building. He says speed follows clarity. He says the good you do in private will open public gates. He says gates respond to integrity like metal to magnet. He says keep the current strong. He says remember, you are not late, you are precise. He says precision arrives when readiness meets right timing. He says this season is that meeting. He says keep going, but go clean. He says keep building, but build true. He says keep shining, but shine steady.